All right, welcome everyone. Sorry we're starting a few minutes late. We obviously had the last panel run over, and it's wonderful to introduce all of you, to welcome all of you here. This event is about green accountability and lessons from innovation and action from civil society in transforming climate finance governance. And I'm Ali Rahim. I'm the program manager for CIVIC, the Civil Society and Social Innovation Alliance, which is the World Bank's new operational and financing platform for collaboration with civil society and social innovators around the world, which succeeds a global partnership for social accountability. And I'm also the global lead for citizen engagement. And very excited today for this topic. This represents work that's been happening over the last 2 years, which represented, one, a step change in how we do this work as the World Bank, and how we bring in actors from the grassroots all the way to global policy leadership and bring these voices in an area that was very underdeveloped at the time, which was the importance of climate governance and the linkage to climate finance. And so with an incredible consortium led by the World Resources Institute, one of the leading climate policy and action networks and institutes in the world. It's very hard to describe what WRI is, but it's an incredible asset for the climate governance system overall. The Huhairu Commission, which is one of the largest Global South translocal networks of grassroots civil society, primarily women-led organizations across the Global South, and South-South-North, which is the leading climate capacity development collective for civil society and social sector actors in the Global South. So it was a dream team consortium that then worked with incredible grassroots organizations across the Global South, collaborating with government to really surface ways in how you actually action and build an architecture to deliver climate finance in an equitable, effective, and efficient way. And so the key lesson from here that we want to share is the importance of the demand-side architecture. There's so much focus on the supply-side architecture, which is critical. And of course, we as the World Bank put a lot of time and attention into that, and we should. But without the demand-side structures, and this is a real structure, and the social architecture that's needed to do these things well requires technical expertise. It requires capacity building, and importantly, it requires finance. And so we have an incredible set of lessons about how you start to surface these kinds of structures, how you build them out, how you start to scale them, how you connect them to government. And so I'm very excited to be joined by some very esteemed panelists who've been leading work both within the platform but also beyond it about the themes we're going to talk about today. So let me introduce the panelists, and then we'll have a few videos, and then we'll get into the discussion. So immediately next to me is a good friend and collaborator of CIVIC, and someone who's led across this agenda for many years is Anne Huddock. She's currently President and CEO of Counterpart International, which has been a leading US-based NGO working around the world and in partnership with a lot of local organizations and leading this participation governance agenda in many critical areas. Anne herself has been a leading commenter and doer on the field of, and even before the current crisis, about what do we need to do to renew and strengthen a participatory architecture and very much connected development outcomes across key global good areas. Earlier in her career, she served in the U.S. Department of State, working as a special assistant for democracy, human rights, and labor in the Bureau of Global Affairs. She holds a PhD in development studies from the University of Sussex, and she's the author of a critical book called NGOs and Civil Society Development, Democracy by Proxy, ? So we'll hear a lot more about that. Next to Anne, we have Jesse Worker, also a good friend, and who co-led the Global Green Accountability Platform, which was financed with the GPSA. And Jesse's been an incredible thought leader on participation governance and climate finance for many years. He currently serves as the Director of Climate Governance at the World Resources Institute. And prior to joining WRI, he also worked for MIT and UC Berkeley on climate campaign actions and technical issues around climate on climate. He has a master's degree in environmental science and public policy from the University of Michigan. Joining us online, we'll have two incredible sub-grantees and leaders in this space from some of the countries we're engaged in. So first is Maria Victoria Ramos. She's the co-founder and executive director of Fiquem Sabendo, which is a Brazilian NGO promoting freedom of information, transparency, and civic oversight. They're part of the Green Accountability Platform, and they're leveraging Brazil's access to information law to promote transparency in Brazil by making data more accessible, to promote meaningful engagement and institutional accountability. I've had the privilege of meeting Maria in different parts of the world because she's an extensive traveler, and she brings these visions to great convenings. She's a very powerful young voice, but young in the right sense. And so she's also been an Ashoka Fellow, a Schwab Foundation social impact entrepreneur, and she's really recognized as a pioneering leader on the innovation in citizen-driven data and open government. And I know because I know her, she's probably embarrassed that I'm saying this, but she's one of those leaders in the world that we should listen to. And I was joking with Anne, I think every major leader leading a major organization or initiative needs someone under 30 whispering in their ear today, especially on topics like climate and AI, and Maria certainly is one of those leaders, though a leader in her own right. And then we also have Demba Seydi, also an incredible leader from one of the key countries, from Senegal. He's the director of programs from CAJUST, which is an NGO that's also part of the Global Green Accountability Platform. He's an expert in natural resource governance and transparency. Previously, he led regional coordination for Publish What You Pay for Francophone Africa, where he accompanied civil society coalitions in the implementation of standards of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And EITI, for those of you who know this space, was one of the first approaches to multi-stakeholder platforms to ensure transparency for a critical sector. And he's worked to enforce the principles of transparency in mining, oil and gas, and strengthen public revenue monitoring mechanisms. And he's played an important role in Senegal in the national debates on institutional reforms, citizen engagement and oversight over public action, and the improvement of economic governance policy. So very glad you guys can join us online. I wish you were here in the room, but I think it's wonderful to have your virtual participation, and we've been thrilled with the work you've been leading and are excited to hear about all of that. So now, why don't we go through 3 videos? We'll have 3 videos from Women for Change in Cameroon, from the Climate Finance Group for Latin America, and from the Huayru Commission in India. So we'll tee those up.
América y el Caribe.
Should we just go to the beginning?
Mi nombre es Sandra Guzmán, soy directora general del Grupo de Financiamiento Climático para Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Y acceder a financiamiento de calidad es una de nuestras grandes misiones. Algo que nos importa a través de este proyecto es no solo mejorar la información sobre en dónde están los flujos de financiamiento, sino sobre todo cómo lograr que esos recursos lleguen a donde son necesarios, en este caso en los estados, en las ciudades, en los gobiernos locales. A través de este proyecto estamos logrando implementar una metodología que nos está ayudando a identificar en dónde está el dinero para poder establecer ese análisis de las brechas que luego nos lleve a mejorar los procesos de planeación. Esto también nos está ayudando a entender cómo mejorar no solo el acceso en términos de cantidad del financiamiento, sino sobre todo de calidad. Asegurar que el financiamiento realmente está atendiendo las necesidades de los actores locales.
Hi, I'm Maria Victoria. I'm the co-founder.
The one thing that at Women for Change we are very proud of is I'm Zone Zero, the Executive Director for Women for Change, which is a sub-regional feminist advocacy organization that works at the intersection of gender, climate justice, and health. The one thing that at Women for Change we are very proud of is being able to localize and demystify the whole framing around climate finance, making climate finance understood at the local level and also engaging women and girls in the conversation of climate finance from the local level right up to the global level. And through this project, we've been able to come up with a manual that has looked at climate finance from a feminist perspective. For instance, what does climate finance mean to a garbage picker? What does climate finance mean to someone who is selling by the roadside? What does climate finance mean to a young girl? And through that, we've had different angles in the way that communities interpret climate finance and also how they understand and contribute towards addressing climate change.
Hi, I'm Naseem from India. I'm member of Vairo Commission. I'm trying to solve the problem of how the countries can make climate action plan and implement through the lens of grassroots women. And I'm proud we are initiated the process at state level to ensure the plan should be made and implemented. I'm coming from Maharashtra, drought-prone area, working with 500,000 women farmers. They should invest into the grassroots women's capacity building, helping them to do climate finance, looking them as a main stakeholder to make climate action plan and implement through the lens of grassroots women.
Wonderful. And so, these represent a subset of the more couple dozen organizations and many leaders who've been part of this initiative doing scalable work of this nature. And so it'll be exciting to hear from those who are with us today about this work. So let's dive in, I think, from sort of the high-level perspective first. And Anne, I'm going to turn to you. So Counterpart has worked closely throughout its history with community-based partners on issues that are often highly global, but really have a critical localized dimension. The aggregate effect of that localized work can be immense. And so particularly, I mean, of course, you've worked in many spaces, but the climate space is what we're here talking about today. So why do you think these community-based partners are so important to implement locally led adaptation and resilience programs? And given how deeply localized governance structures can be, like, what lessons have you learned from scaling these approaches? And are there principles of civic infrastructure or institutional support that make local adaptation more sustainable and more impactful at a national level, and that eventually influences our global work?
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today for this really important discussion. I think one of the things you said in that question is a starting point for me, which is how do we look at scale in the aggregate for lots of small initiatives that can have ripple effects that create much bigger endeavors. I think there's always a tendency to want to do something big first. And I think now, especially in times of funding crises and growing challenges, it's so important to really center things on the local communities. And I think for Counterpart, what we've learned is there are three things that are critically important as learnings for us. The first is that for these initiatives to work in whatever sector you're working in, but particularly I think for climate, you really have to hire from within the communities you're serving. And that's foundational. And just quickly on school feeding, which is something that Counterpart does a whole lot of around the world, we have board members who've been beneficiaries of school feeding, chiefs of party in multiple countries running the programs who've been beneficiaries of school feeding, staff in Senegal, beneficiaries of school feeding. So we take this very seriously, and it's not just to bring them in to hear their voices, it's because that's where the programs need to be centered, on the people who are living through these challenges. And so I think the second thing that's really important is to remember that it's not our job to draw people into these policy discussions or to climate finance. They are the architects of it. And so really, again, residing in those circles, making sure that everything is anchored there is a different approach than saying, how do we bring people in? And I think that's something that probably is worth unpacking in the Q&A. And then, I wish I had some sexy IT, drone, AI type of comment to give you on this, but I really think right now, in the tumultuous world that we're living in, getting back to a back to basics approach is absolutely essential. And one of the things that I think we need to talk about more for these issues to really come to fruition, particularly in the climate governance space and climate finance space, is we have to invest in what I call patient organizational capital. You know, you've all heard about patient capital, where you're expecting your return to come in many, many years down the line. But we need to think about patient organizational capital. Many of these organizations working in climate finance are very nascent. And so we have to invest in them. And, you know, the last thing I would say is investment means everything from upskilling to mentorship to peer accompaniment to endowments. And nobody's talking about endowments, and everybody should be talking about endowments if we're serious about organizational capacity. There's a lot of talk right now about having groups become profit-generating enterprises either on the side or, you know, coming up with some social enterprise that they can do, and that may work for some. But for many, what they really need is an investment, not just in their overhead costs, but truly an endowment that can kick off revenue so that they can thrive.
There was so much in that statement, Anne, and I think what you said about the local architects is key. And there is a very real social architecture around the world. Some of it's informal, a lot of it is formal. But that social architecture is in real-time collapse right now, a lot of that. And so how do we preserve the social architecture of the world? Of course, there was a need for renewal as well, so it's an opportunity. And I think you bringing in that finance piece is key. I think, of course, we're at the sidelines of the World Bank annual meetings. There has been a year-plus discussion about renewal of the international financial architecture. And the civic architecture also needs a financial architecture. And I think that is a part of the discussion we need to expand. We're trying to do that with civic and other initiatives, but I think that's a key thing, that, you know, social capital needs real capital. And how do we re-envision that? So we'll come back to this, and I think it's a very important point and a critical point we really need to think of at much higher levels when we think of the renewal of public finance internationally. Jesse, turning to you, you know, the global-local interface has been such a critical part of the design of the Green Accountability Platform. And I think Anne was getting to this already, that need to create a vertically integrated local-to-global architecture matters. And, you know, as the localization debates were happening, you know, in a previous era of the development world, we were thinking about what that meant. But that connectivity has been so important in this model and other models that you've supported as WRI as well. So based on the experience, how has this platform worked to sort of bridge global finance frameworks and these big discussions about global climate finance and NDCs and you know, this cascading down, which usually often stops at the country level and the government level. But you've been architecting, and we've been architecting something, you know, building that, what exists between governments and communities, but yet it is channeling up, and this is an early stage model, but it'd be great to share some of these lessons and what it might point to in the future.
Thanks, Ali. Yes, so WRI, if you're not familiar with World Resources Institute, we work to shift the human systems that are interconnected, that have profound impacts on climate, nature, and human social inequality. So those especially include how we manage food, land, water, how we produce and consume energy, how we design and build cities. And the key structures we see that undergird those systems are economics, finance, and governance. So I share that because I think many folks that they're familiar with WRI are familiar with some of our platforms and tools like Global Forest Watch, Climate Watch data, or other tools that we do where we bring together large global data sets and help people make sense of them, tell stories, understand what companies and governments are or are not doing. But we've actually been working for decades on supporting civil society coalitions, working at the national and subnational level to establish the rights they need to test their government's levels of transparency, to understand who is able to be included in those decision-making processes, and then what follows. What are the mechanisms for oversight, and what kind of capacity building and critically civic space and political economy needs to be in place. So how this connects together is that we are trying to ensure that, you know, first, we know that the amount of the sheer quantity of finance, as Sandra Guzman said, is critically important from bilaterals, from multilaterals, to be mobilized from wealthy countries and to meet those commitments. But as Climate Policy Initiative and others have shown, still, even in some of the countries that need the most finance, we would still anticipate the majority of finance mobilized to respond to climate challenges, adaptation and mitigation. The majority in most countries is still going to be domestically mobilized. So even as we're tracking the flows of of climate finance flows, once it gets to the country level, we oftentimes don't understand how it's being defined, through which intermediaries or agencies it's going through, how subnational and national, how ministries of finance are connecting with subnational governments. And so this is where we need to build strong partnerships with civil society and critically with local subnational governments as well. WRI we're situated in over a dozen countries, and we have a lot of longstanding relationships working with governments. But it's what we are trying to do through this project is to build a lasting capacity of our partners and respond to the needs that they've identified to be able to work more effectively with governments, and in many cases provide that capacity to local actors to be able to better access and understand sources of climate finance. And then through these networks of civil society organizations that we'll get more into what those networks have looked like and what we've been trying to support from the support of the World Bank is how they can how they define the capacity that they need to form stronger networks at the country level. As the loss of ODA, as that has plummeted, we need civil society organizations to be even better connected, to be sharing tools and complementing each other's strengths. So I think through the remarks you'll hear today and other examples we can show, we're seeing, real right to information experts coming into the climate finance space and being able to test the transparency and availability of critical information from different agencies at the country level that maybe a more technically oriented climate policy organization just doesn't have the background to do. Or to ensure that organizations that we're supporting have clear constituencies, that they know who their people are, so they cannot be credibly accused by governments in countries that are shrinking civic space that they don't actually represent communities, because they do represent and they can demonstrate that. And that goes towards building those more lasting trust and legitimacy with the government agency interlocutors that they need to be working with to really show and influence those anything from local disaster management policies with which our partners in Cameroon are working on to the Just Energy Transition Partnership that you're going to hear Demba talk about as well. So I think that's some examples. There are many. And then I think we as WRI, we need to think about how can we, first of all, help these organizations be in a better position to access more finance down the road and to be able to influence directly those global conversations. So helping them understand how the localized issues they work on are reflected in, what does the adaptation goal indicators mean for them locally? I think that's the role of an organization like WRI and national civil society organizations to help those organizations be able to connect their local work to the global level.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jesse. And before I want to respond to something, but just technical team, if it's possible to have the speakers on the back screen there, it would help the panel to see them, if it's possible. And so, Jesse, I think, again, so much richness here and sort of intersects a lot with the comments from Anne. And so thinking really about the ODA cuts and, this issues of networks and connectivity, and it was interesting, I remember almost a year ago probably, we were having this conversation. And now, it's even more urgent than ever. This was the direction of movement. So what do you need to do to support that connectivity and network building and network development amongst organizations? What does that mean financially? And then, the trust and legitimacy questions, I think, Jesse, you raise are fundamental. And we not only have a global society crisis, we have a global trust crisis right now. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which is the most prominent indicator of social trust in the world, it's run for 25 years, is the lowest numbers this year. 60% of people have a moderate to high grievance in their governments or in the private sector in their countries. So what do you need to do to ensure, whether it's for climate or anything else, that you're restoring trust? And that requires, new mechanisms and pathways. And I think that's a great lead-in to our other panelist. And Maria, I'm going to come to you first. And this time we were in the OGP summit together, and I called on Maria at a high-level dinner where she wasn't prepared. This time you're prepared, but you did fantastically. And you know, you've been a leader in this space for some time, and I think trust requires applied transparency. And of course, this applies to climate finance too. And so transparency as a principle is one thing, but you need structures, you need to leverage existing laws. And so, you know, there was, 10, 15 years ago, this great effort to have freedom of information laws passed around the world. The World Bank actually played a significant role in that. There has been a lot of backsliding both in the existence of those laws and the demand-side architecture which supports those laws, but they do exist still in many countries. But to really leverage them well, you need innovations that draw on these existing laws. And FICEM Sabendo has really worked on that, and also bringing that into a new era where we have new technologies, new ways to really leverage what those laws provide us potentially, and the ability to analyze larger amounts of data and use new tools. So, working with subnational institutions, you've taken a very applied way to the climate problem and the climate finance problem. So tell us about the story and both the strengths and challenges you faced sort of as you're trying to deploy this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ali. Always great to see you, and Jesse for all the support. So just very quickly, FICEM Sabendo, are you being able to hear
Yes,
myself?
we hear you very clearly. All good, yeah.
FICEM Sabendo mission is to reduce the power imbalance between the state and society, and we do that through access to information. And we've been working a lot on monitoring public policy and creating the space, the information, and the ecosystem needed to co-create new public policy based on evidence on the data that we've opened ourselves. And as you said, well, Brazil has a great FOI law. I've been traveling a lot in the past 2 years, and I'm always surprised at how good our Freedom of Information Act structure actually is. And also, I think something the Global South really enjoys is most of our government is very digital. So that makes it very helpful in that sense. But the problem, as always, is making the structure from the federal executive branch cascade into the subnational level. One example is at FICEM Sabendo, we expose the undisclosed data of companies being fined for environmental violations. At first, the government tried to put that under privacy laws, and we were able to reverse that. And then we tried to do that in all the states, since every state has their own environmental laws. And that is very important for climate finance, because all of the proceeds from the fines go to environmental protection. And one thing that we also helped reveal was the fact that almost $10 billion in fines were going to expire before the government was paid for, and that money would just go out of the air. And since we showed that in time, they were able to get some laws passed to make the time length longer. But then when you go to the states, we actually got answers from all the states after a lot of effort. But then you can't create a national map of environmental violations because the data has no standardization whatsoever. So what we've been working on right now is laws that really clearly say exactly what the government has to collect and how they have to present it, so that we can make it comparable across all subnational levels. And in terms of actual expenditure, it's the same. We have, since all the corruption scandals, a lot of Latin America countries, with the help of some international development agencies, have passed a lot of fiscal responsibility laws, which brought a lot of cohesion and transparency in the expenditure and money transfers between states and cities and the federal government, but they did not take into account the climate part of this. So what we're working on right now is to try to get clear tags referring to which money is supposed to go to climate mitigation or climate change combating, in a way that we can actually track the money coming all the way from international or the national government all the way into the cities. And we've been also investing in artificial intelligence for that, because freedom of information is still a luxury of mostly the economic centers of the country. So Sao Paulo or Rio or people around big universities. And with AI, we think we can really democratize this whole process and make it useful also to the people that we're working with during the Green Accountability formation. So just to finalize this, with the Green Accountability Platform, we are training over 600 indigenous community leaders in the Amazon region and the Northeast, and with the Climate Auditors Program. And what experience shows is there is the will for engagement, there's the need for information, but the whole infrastructure of the process needs to be really democratized in order for it to be actually usable and feasible.
Thank you, Maria. Whenever I hear you speak, I'm inspired, and I'm inspired because it's so concrete, but it has that justice and equity vision. And I think this is the reality we live in today, and the kinds of innovations that are emerging that allow us to build a real architecture. It's a rights-based approach, but it's a rights-based approach that leverages technology, that leverages social mobilization. And so I think, again, so much richness in what you shared. And this is a broader discussion in this space, is that there's a lot that's being done on the legal frameworks that are needed, discussions about transparency of government expenditures, but there's much less being discussed about why the demand side of this is so important. Frankly, when these laws exist in the global north, they only function because it's a very rich ecosystem of people who can take this technical data, convey it to people, convey back with technical expertise to legislators and others and regulators about what needs to be done. And the concern that Anne and others have raised is that as the financing for this kind of work starts to diminish around the world, how do we ensure we sustain that? Because without it, it affects the outcomes of how this money is spent. And so this idea of training and building the capacity of the most local people, because it's one thing to advocate for climate justice, but climate justice without understanding how finance and money is spent to those ends, it doesn't complete the loop. So I think very powerful words. Will come back to you, and thank you so much, Maria, as always. Next, we go to Demba Saidi, who's also done incredible work in Senegal. When we included Senegal as one of the countries in the platform, we were very interested because it was going to be one of the first JETP programs, just energy transition programs in sub-Saharan Africa. And the JETPs were a very significant instrument the international community was developing about the large-scale energy transitions. Of course, this is also tied to major work the World Bank is leading. The largest significant single development initiative right now is the Mission 300 to electrify 300 million Africans. But to do this well, you need a participatory architecture, and that requires investment and requires unique interfaces between community, governments, and industry. And what Kajust has been working on, is really showing how we can start to get that going. So share with us, Demba, a little bit about how we will know if the process has been successful, what are the incentives for government, for industry, for communities to come together on something like this, and in the end, will we provide greater access to JETP benefits and opportunities than without this kind of multi-stakeholder approach? And then, of course, we always want to hear about the challenges as well. So over to you, Demba.
Great. Thank you so much, and greetings from Dakar, where I'm seated, and with 31 degrees Celsius, whereas at this period of time, Dakar, which is a kind of peninsula, should be around 15 to 20 degrees maximum, right, in October. But yeah, unfortunately, we are still we keep facing those effects of the climate change. At the same time, in the northeast of the country, we are facing floodings where communities and population are getting displaced. You can see that on the media. Just Google it, and then you're going to find every single information about those floodings affecting people in the northeast of the country. And these discussions are happening in a context where the government of Senegal is tempted to prioritize, let's say, fossil extraction, whether it's oil and gas. And at the same time, that governments had signed in June 2023 a JETP agreement, Just Energy Transition Plan agreement. So it appears for us as a kind of contradiction, right? And that's why in Kagist, our agenda is community-centered, because communities need to be included in all those processes, whether it is climate response or whether it is the energy transition implementation as well. So a couple of precepts or principles matter for us. The first one is inclusion. The second one is participation. And the third one is transparency. For inclusion, it matters for us because the communities are often seen as victims, whereas we think that they can be the solution at the local level. And so we don't want these policies to be urban-centered, just implemented in the urban cities, because they are visible and leaving all those community groups aside of those policies that are going to be implemented or designed and implemented in the JETP process. That's important for us. The other thing is that we need that social license and trust between those communities and the government itself and the companies to make sure that the transition is just. One of the principles of justice in this, we think that it is the participation of that, so that the policies become solution-led policies using domestic adaptation and mitigation approaches, those that can drive innovation, right? And then we have these kind of domestic approaches that can inform the policies the government is trying to implement. So that means how we can measure the success of that. One indicator would be the level of consultation and participation of the communities in the climate response initiatives. Secondly, the JETP investment plan should reflect those community needs. The government has recently disclosed that investment plan. We are trying to disaggregate it and make sure that communities see themselves within those plans that are developed. Thirdly, the government is on the process of revising the NDC, the National Determined, and we want to make sure that reflects the community needs as well. And finally, in terms of investment on renewables, we need to see a kind of balance in terms of energy access, because those communities in those areas don't really have energy access. The majority of the communities in the country do not have access to power. That is the minimum, and the sustainable power as well, that impact all their economic activities and their social life as well. So in terms of incentives and approaches we have used is firstly through the project and the grant we received from WRI. It was as part of the Green Accountability platform or initiative. It was to raise the awareness of those communities, because we are facing a big challenge. The challenge is a kind of conflicting narrative between what the government as a new producer or oil and gas producer is selling to communities, and the greenwashing from the companies as well, who promise access to power, employment, and revenues as well. So in this context, it's really challenging to make sure that people and the community at the community level understand what we mean by JETP or climate response, etc., although they are facing directly the effects of climate change. But that greenwashing, that communication hype around the fossil project is trying to hinder all those, the awareness of communities of the effects of climate issues as well. So first thing, as an incentive, awareness raising. Secondly, making sure that we have a disaggregated information. And what we did is involving other voices that are different from the traditional actors people are used to see. We mobilize some artists, whether they are comedy or music artists, to endorse our advocacy messages and make them really simple and accessible to those communities so that people understand what we mean by the advocacy work we are doing. That is the second thing. The third thing is involving those communities at the design process of that investment plan and the NDC plan, because what we needed is to be really proactive to make sure that we don't have all those documents already designed, but we try to inform them before the government designed them as well. And domesticating the narrative of the JETP also was really key for us, making sure that all those investment we expect from renewables should be something led first by the local communities as well. And local content was also key for that, making sure that moving or shifting from fossil to renewables may bring also additional added value to what people have been facing in terms of access to employment, or making sure that we can provide all those services at country level. Challenges, yes, we had a couple of them, and I'm going to mention here. The first one was the perception of all those climate and JETP initiatives from the community level. Due to the massive communication from the government and the companies, people used to think that this is a kind of global north agenda, because what they used to sell them are the message is that Africa is polluting less, we need power, we need jobs from the fossil extraction, we need the revenues that should be reflected in the national budget. So that was a kind of main challenge, to make sure that we, let's say, we challenge the narrative led by the government and the companies as well. And I think constructing our advocacy message around that domestication of local understanding of all that climate issues was really key. So for now, these are the key points I wanted to share with you, and happy to receive any question you have there. Thanks.
Thank you, Demba. Again, very rich presentation and summary of what you've done. And I think, you know, what's very important is this emphasis on, one, ensuring these perspectives get into these key instruments, investment plans, NDC revisions, and that there is also consideration of the resources that need to flow to the local level, whether it's to subnational governments, as we were discussing here, but to actual community organizations, community structures. And what strikes me is, you haven't quantified this, but I'm sure you have this work with you, is the small upfront investment. I mean, this has struck me across the platform in these 5 countries, has such potential for amplified impact on how climate finance is spent and the efficiency of quality. But yet, without these kinds of deliberate initiatives, a lot of this investment doesn't happen, and it doesn't take that much. Relative to the scale of the investments we're talking about, it's pennies on the dollar. And so I think we really have to consider, in the changing financial landscape, we may not see return of the ODA levels we expect, but there are other places where financing can flow, whether it's MDB investment project, whether it's national budgets, whether it's hybrid capital stacks for large-scale energy infrastructure investments. What we're asking for is a very small part and actually goes directly to the return on investment. And so as we get to the independent evaluation of this platform, which is starting, I think we want to start to spell out that picture, because this was really a pilot case. We convened a conference at Chatham House 3 years ago, and this idea of transparency, participation, accountability is in the Paris Climate Agreement. environment, but it wasn't really being operationalized. And this work, alongside other work that similar friends and partners have been doing, is starting to show this is an investable category. This actually is not just about climate justice. This is about getting the climate outcomes right and spending money well. And so, I think the JETP in Senegal is a great example. And on that, and to turn back to you on sort of the strategic lens here, this work you've spent a lifetime, all of us actually have here in different angles, that we need to start reframing participation as an investable category, something that ties to outcome, that's something that really influences the quality of capital. And so, you've been thinking about this in a while. How can we take lessons like this and bring them into that higher level discussion?
I love that question, and I have so many examples I could share, but let me just start with one quick one and then maybe widen the aperture to talk about some common threads that I've seen across such examples. The first example that I would give is in the Dominican Republic, and it really speaks to the issue of financing that you just raised, that you can actually do a lot with a little and see the return on investment. We had money from a small family foundation here in Maryland, and that money allowed us to work with youth in schools. And what was important about that was from a very young age, they became stewards of the environment. They got out of their schools into the environment around them, learned how to manage resources, but natural resources. But more importantly, many of them saw that there could be a career path and a job at the end of this. So all of a sudden, not only did they want to protect their natural environment, but they actually saw that this could, for them, be a sustainable pathway for their own future. So that was very inspiring. And based on that work, then we were able to build out a program where we did some of the first grants for coral reef restoration, and we were working with resilient rice crops. And so from all of that, we began to work cross-boundary between the DR and Haiti on governance councils, local governance councils. And I think that's the piece of this. I mentioned the other things because I think doing those things is what gave us the trust and the context and the understanding of where a strategic entry point might be for wider impact. And this integrated marine ecosystem management project really was able to bring together multi-stakeholders from both sides, Haiti and the DR, and they were local fishers, and they were representatives of both public and private sectors that sat on these councils. And so each council then defined its own operating procedures and priorities for marine protection, and then we supported them with capacity strengthening, what I talked about, that patient organizational capital, to further bolster their resources and their community management, stakeholder engagement, and then really importantly, to your point about return on the investment, was the monitoring efforts. And this then led to the formation of a transboundary working group. So we had then 11 fishing groups from Haiti and 9 from the DR, and they fostered this transborder management of protected areas. And then they formally committed to working together to monitor, manage, and protect coastal and marine resources in the border areas. So I think it's really an important example because we didn't have a lot of money to do that, but what we had were some of the things that I would highlight in a list of, say, 5 things that I think are common principles. And the first is grants. Grants are really they're not a means to an end. They are really a foundational tool in your toolkit. And I know WRI, Demba mentioned a grant that they received from WRI. These grants are not just a way to move money. They're most importantly, in my view, a way to create partnerships. And Counterpart was founded 60 years ago by a priest and a movie star. So we're really firm believers in not just partnerships, but really unlikely partnerships. And we're not denominational. So the fact that a priest founded us makes it even more unlikely. So I say that because I think for these climate challenges, you all know better than I do that you've got to bring different people into the fold to be able to solve them. So grants can lead to partnerships, and all of that leads to trust. And without trust, none of this is going to work. And I mentioned already the fourth thing, which is pathways to employment. People have to see that being engaged in these ways can also create a job for them. Maybe not everybody, but there needs to be a pathway for employment. That's one of the most important things on government agendas. So while they may push back on the climate, they're going to push back less on jobs. And then I've mentioned already the small money having a big impact. We all know that resources are dwindling and being cut in unprecedented ways. We can take that as a disaster, which of course it is in many ways, but in other ways it creates space for smaller organic initiatives to de-risk models, to create these partnerships, to spur innovation, and then build that trust. So that's why I keep coming back to grants. I think we need more grants mechanisms that allow small things to happen. I mean, you can't innovate your way out of a situation without money, but money isn't the only thing you need.
I think that's beautifully put, and I mean that was in the vision when we were all crafting the Green Accountability Platform, that it had to involve sub-grants. It had to involve, but it couldn't just be a grant-making mechanism. We've also seen many grant-making mechanisms that are just putting out money without a concerted purpose. So here, that network development, that global to local architecture, that knowledge sharing, all these actors who are doing this incredible work in 5 countries are connected to each other. They're advocating, they're bringing these into policy dialogue so we can connect all these pieces. And I think we increasingly need to make an evidence case of why this matters. Actually, at the beginning of this work, one of the leading sustainability consulting firms worked with us for their blended finance task force and released a report called Better Accountability, Better Finance. And we did some initial modeling because the data is sparse, but what does upstream investment in transparency participation mean for the quality of capital? And there were very interesting findings coming out of that report for what each dollar could imply on utilization and effectiveness of investment. And so I think this case becomes all the more important in the current climate because the money will come from private and public money that is meant for the core investment, but a portion of that can go to our work. And I think that's a case we need to make. And Maria, I want to turn to you. And this is one of those questions which you haven't prepared for, but I know you'll have an interesting answer for. And that's the counterfactual. You kind of were hinting at this. But if you didn't have the kind of work you're bringing in and this network of actors you're working with are bringing in to ensure the freedom of information law and these legal regimes are engaging these communities, and that feedback is going into how you fine-tune the laws so they actually reflect the situation in the ground. What happens? If that work isn't there, what would you see?
I think we are seeing what is happening in Mexico, for example, where they dismantled the whole FOI agency nationally, the pushback in Germany and a lot of European countries, where privacy laws are now being used to shelter oligarchs and a lot of things that are very important for the climate accountability. And I think the most important thing is building on what Anne was saying, is having this strong network of probably smaller organizations. We were speaking during the dinner, what happens if these big NGOs go away? Would anybody go to the streets to do something about it? And I think one point that I was trying to make is the private sector has moved away from investing in big legacy companies for a while now, and the thing is investing in startups, right? And I think we need to get this mindset in the third sector as well, because the smaller ones are the ones that are able to quickly see when the government is pushing towards changing the FOI laws in a bad way, and can quickly during the weekend make decisions and do the movement needed to stop the thing before the big NGOs can actually pass the information from the lower level to the big level and then make decisions. And in terms of involvement of the actual community, working with this climate auditors program that we've been doing with the WRI grant, it's very clear that most of their concerns are not related to governmental actions. They're mostly concerned about the big investments coming from international private companies that are building things in the Amazon, and they have no way to, give opinions on what's happening in their own territory. They don't know where the money is coming from or how it will be used. So we would need help from the World Bank and other international organizations on how to make transparency actually involve these private actors, because they're really changing and impacting these communities in really big ways. And one problem, for example, coming from the carbon market, we're seeing huge multinational organizations making deals directly with indigenous leaders without any mediation or intermediation or public consultations. And that's not a fair way to play this game, So how can we create this transparency and accountability system that will, make this whole new climate finance world actually actable and just... I don't know if I answered your question, Ali, but...
No, you answered it really well. And I think, therein lies the challenge, is when we're looking at both international private investment, public investment, how we ensure that this is built upstream into how we plan. And I mean, we were having these conversations in the health space very recently, just this last week at the World Health Summit. And you have private companies, big multinationals. One of the ones we're collaborating with is Bayer and its foundation that are investing in local communities. Their consumers are smallholder farmers, right? Agricultural inputs, health, and they want to do sustainability investments. But a lot of this has been fragmented. And we were talking right before the panel of the social innovation ecosystem. There's traditional civil society. We need more intersectionality between this work, and this startup culture is out there, but it can link also to what the strengths of the traditional NGO systems are. So we have to think of a much more dynamic third space, and then we also have to think about creating a new category of capital for social capital, in a sense, and that's our challenge today. It's not going to be the old system, but money will matter. And so how do we mobilize the money? How do we use the existing institutional structures we have, like the World Bank, like private funds, like institutional investors, like pension funds? How do we work with those sustainability practices to think in this new way, even traditional corporate social responsibility investments? So there's a need for a coordination. There's a great report out from Bridgespan, which is an advisor to philanthropies, that talks about this. And there's been reasons why these traditional streams of financing have kind of just covered their own space, and that just won't work anymore. And so something very much for all of us to think about. So I want to open it up for questions, and we'll bring some of the other speakers back in too. So I believe there's a roving mic in the room, and so please just raise your hand, identify yourself, and just briefly ask. We'll maybe take, depending on the question, we may take a couple at a time. The floor is open.
Thank you very much, for the speakers. It's been really interesting. My name is Karina Gilfil, and I'm with the UN Convention Against Corruption Global Civil Society Organization. We're a coalition where we have about 400 civil society organizations across the globe that work on anti-corruption, but also human rights, accountability, transparency issues. And yeah, I just wanted to build upon this theme about, in this new challenging environment we're in, Jesse, you had mentioned the very important point of domestic resource mobilization at the country level to try to, make sure all of the money, we can get as much money as possible on climate finance and make sure that it goes for its intended use. So, and I just wanted to flag that some of the anti-corruption frameworks at the country level ideally should be deployed to do that, and also may provide some technical assistance, some other kinds of resources to help do that. And so through the UN Convention Against Corruption, which covers embezzlement or bribery, other kinds of ways that money goes missing, that could help at the domestic level. And ideally, you'd have the NDCs. You'd tap into these global anti-corruption frameworks and other kind of agreements that would help. So I just wanted to raise that to see what the panelists would think about trying to make those kind of connections to on this issue of domestic resource mobilization, and also with climate finance, really using open data, open contracting, really following the money, and then making sure that communities, actually have oversight over this. And just to say that there's going to be a conference of the UNCAC this December, and we're hoping to get. We were calling for governments to adopt a resolution on combating environmental crime and corruption, and also, looking at trying to address climate finance and address the climate crisis through better governance. And so, any specific ideas you have about this resolution, what should be in there? It should have communities in there, right? Go right down to the bottom, and also follow-up actions to try to include civil society in such a resolution. Thank you.
Great question, Jesse. I'm going to turn to you to start that. I think there's a lot we can do. We're obviously working with a lot of people in this community already, and I think these existing instruments are critical to leverage. Yeah,
thank you. So I think you raise a really important point. Sorry, I missed your name. Karina. Thank you, Karina. So as you know, you referenced the disconnect between NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which are what countries submit about every 5 years to the UNFCCC on their climate, how they're going to meet their to the collective climate goals. And when it comes to how countries are setting up national institutions and processes, how they're involving their civil society, this is often an area, and my colleague Guy over there can correct me if I'm wrong. She's more of a Paris Agreement expert than I am, but it's often an area where it's left to it's not a shall, it's not a country shall do things in this way. And it's more countries should, countries should involve their civil society. So it's embedded in articles, and it's led to, very important working groups within that space on access to information and public participation. But oftentimes it's not enough to create those institutional linkages between existing institutions of accountability, such as, you didn't name them, but Supreme Audit institutions or ombudsman and other. So I don't know that anyone has really at the country level examined to what extent those institutions have the capacity, have the political economy support, and are coordinated enough to be able to monitor and serve as an accountability function for different communities on the delivery of climate policies, their implementation. So I agree that we should be trying to work with established institutions at the national and subnational level and see how they need to be adapted, how they need to be equipped. I mean, I think similarly to how we've had over the past several decades, efforts to build capacity either through green courts or tribunals, or just build capacity of judges to be able to have the technical expertise to rule on climate, to make judgments on climate relevant issues. So that's, I think, going to be a really important part. And I just want to step back and say that we understood in this effort, just on some of the nuts and bolts, we knew this was only going to be an implementation window for these organizations of 2 years or less. And so we knew that they're working on major governance. As Maria said, they're shifting the power between state and society. And that oftentimes that work is going to take more than 2 years, right? Nevertheless, we have seen responses like in Brazil, where the public prosecutor's office has issued a recommendation based on the advocacy of Instituto Fronteras, another partner who's not here today, around the implementation of the new carbon markets law in the new voluntary carbon markets law in Brazil, and whether they're actually implementing free, prior, and informed consent for communities who could be better benefiting from those carbon credits that are challenging other ministries in their implementation of that law. But we know that we need to listen, first of all, connect these 25 organizations that are receiving grants with other networks that are well suited to be able to support their work, that they can gather tools and be connected with other networks. We're not the only community of practice out there, right? So how do we make sure that that we can build a network of networks? And to that end, we've invited organizations like Transparency International and others working on anti-corruption and for those organizations that we're working with that are really they recognize that the political economy in their country would be conducive to taking that message and to work through those existing institutions. I think that matters a lot. The way that we set this up was to try to be responsive to the climate governance challenges in each country. So our staff identified about 3 thematic issues in each country. But under those broad thematic issues, we accepted applications and really tried to proactively draw out applications from civil society organizations that we had never worked with before. I think that was really important. So we had to build relationships, but we wanted to make sure that this was not just going to go to large NGOs that were already very visible to WRI. And accept applications in different languages. But we had to be very flexible to what their programs of work look like. I mean, what climate finance accountability looks like in Cameroon is often just defining what climate finance is at the local level, setting up those multi-stakeholder platforms at the district level in a very geographically what can be a fragmented country. And that looked very different from Brazil, of course, or Mexico, where you have like very mature legal institutions, or you have a federated system and so forth. So we needed to be able to, and then bring those organizations to find where are the common points of learning across these countries. Where can they learn from each other? Obviously, building the country networks was really critically important. But through past experience, for instance, our work around the Escazú Agreement, we understood that building regional networks of learning could be really important for regional advocacy as well. So we're hoping to build from that. I just want to leave the message that, Ali, we've heard the message of the return on investment. I mean, just to be perfectly open, it was a little less than $400,000 in 5 grants per country, right? So. Yet we're seeing governance outcomes, we're seeing new relationships. A lot has happened with that really pretty small amount of funding. And so we hope that we want to encourage, if you're talking to donors, some fantastic organizations that are building those institutional connections, and we hope to build on that.
And I mean, I think this point Jesse makes, obviously we want to continue this work and expand it, and the upfront investment is a rounding error, less than a rounding error in the kind of investments we make as institutions. And so I think this is something clearly that UNCAT Coalition and others, we need to start raising it. If you see the statement of our largest shareholder just came out, it's public, to the Development Committee, there was actually a phrase on the importance of anti-corruption and transparency as we invest. I mean, so it was quite interesting. Of course, people like me were very interested to see that and saying, okay, good. So, but that this part of the investment pie matters. It's not just what we do to strengthen government systems, but the kind of work we're supporting. So, and I want to bring in Demba here for a second on this question. Demba, just quickly, because you were alluding to some of this, and for the energy infrastructure space, I mean, traditionally we have seen whenever you have a large uptick in infrastructure investment, is actually accompanied historically by, large corruption risks. And we were hearing our UNCAT colleague here, refer to open procurement and open contracting, and the kinds of structures you need to make sure that the right companies are bidding. There's stuff around beneficial ownership, transparency, all these kinds of things that require people to be aware. And so I know you guys are thinking of some of this. So just briefly share a little bit about why this corruption issue and quality issue matters so much, especially in a context like Senegal. But very briefly, because we're going to do a breakout group next.
Sure. Transparency really matters in our context. And as you know, we are in another very significant contextual issue, including the alleged hidden debt. I think you have heard about that from those who followed news about the IMF alleging that the Senegalese former government has hidden a huge debt, and the new regime has just disclosed recently, and that is getting really critical for the budget and the finances of the country. But overall, corruption and transparency are key issues in our context, and that's why we've been for the last couple of months throughout the implementation of the project included that issue in our discussions as part of policy dialogue we organize here in Senegal, to make sure that at least wherever this kind of investment should happen, we know how the structure of the financing is working first. That is really important, and who is doing what on the scene And that is really important as well, because the scheme of, let's say, granting all those opportunities of market and this struggle between local enterprises and other enterprises that should be positioned in the market is really key for us as well. So that's why we insisted on the multi-stakeholder platform to make sure that all those stakeholders know what is happening, to avoid at the maximum level the risk of corruption and the risk of conflict of interest sometimes happen in this.
Thank you, Demba. Very important to hear that view from very important investment context. And Senegal is a major market in West Africa and will be at the front of many of these new efforts to build energy infrastructure in Africa. So because we practice what we preach, we're going to go to a phase here where we have some breakouts, and then we're going to reconvene, and you will hear sort of some last words from our speakers. So Celine, you want to run the group here to how we'll do this breakout?
Yes. So maybe we can have this section right over here, all of you in the back, so we want to minimize movement, and then this group over here, and maybe the 4 of you, and then 2 of you here, all there. And so we have some guiding questions, but of course, based on the discussion and what you think were the main issues, we'd like you to also lead that conversation as well. But I'll read out some of the questions that Thank you. I'll read out some of the questions that are just suggestions for you to keep in mind as we're discussing. So, what institutional barriers, in your view, most often prevent civil society from engaging meaningfully in climate finance decisions, and how could organizations and MDBs like the bank help in, addressing this? Another is locally led initiatives can be highly effective, but often remain smaller scale. What funding or institutional models have you seen in your work or elsewhere that allow civil society innovations to scale sustainably without losing their local grounding? And how can donors and international financial institutions better support multi-level accountability ecosystems from local communities to national audits to global reporting, such as on climate funds and JETPs? And last is, if you could change one thing about how climate finance is currently governed or tracked to make it more accountable, more equitable, what would it be? So pick and choose, or come up with something completely new, up to you. But we'll have a quick 10-minute discussion and then wrap up. And then we'll have one person from each group just very, very quickly summarize what the discussion was about.
So please start discussing.
There's not that many climate sessions in all of civil society possible.
Valerie is the director of climate change. She and I were YPs together. NJP. Junior professionals. So that's our first category. So Valerie and I. Like prior to the YP. So I mean, yeah. So the YP's been around much longer, but usually people were up 30 to 20 something. So Valerie's maybe 2 years.
Like we tried to get governance go a little bit. I have like really bad memories and panic attacks, and I think Oh yes, I think I might have talked with Maria or one of her colleagues a while ago. Yeah, yeah, that no, that her. I mean, exactly, and they're doing. It sounds like they're really doing some interesting work. Also at the state level, it sounds really complex, but they're working with identity access to internet. That's like IMF could require that too. It's all linked. we've been trying to promote that. Our paper said breaking the silos. That was like 8 months ago. We had that out, and now it's like, yeah, what's going to, but maybe even more so in this climate, you need to do those. Oh, it'd be great to team up. Are you all doing advocacy? Yeah, please help. Yeah, our own yeah, we are. Yeah, exactly.
The opposite one.
All right, we're going to reconvene here. So just have your last word. And
We didn't get a big crowd, but the retention was.
pick one rapporteur, and we'll just do 45 seconds to a minute. So lightning round. So could we get everyone's attention again?
That's a good sign too. They don't want to stop.
I see there's very good discussion because we're going to have to wrap in. So the mic is coming to you. So Celine will give it to the rapporteur in your group. It's okay. We have to end at 12:40. So just by organized. So just pass the mic to the rapporteur. Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, I think in our group we discussed about the lack of frameworks, lack of political will, inclusions by CXOs, putting a framework that would allow, if there are new solutions, that the framework would give the CSO an opportunity to liaise with the relevant parties or bodies who are promoting this. I believe I said it right.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Khadija Collins. I'm a first-year MBA student at Georgetown University. So in my group, there's lots of discussions. So I'm going to try my best to put it all together. But basically, we talked about, in terms of governance, hopefully having more regional frameworks for carbon markets. To Jesse's point, it varies greatly from country or to locality, but maybe having something centralized and then being able to tweak it based on the local context. And then that came from the discussion that we were having about the carbon markets in Brazil and the lack of transparency. As Maria mentioned, lots of actors are going in and making deals directly with indigenous people, and there's lack of transparency there. So hopefully having more frameworks to set the standard for that. And then I learned a little bit about ODAs from another colleague here, official development assistants, and trying to find a way to localize this aid a bit more and tapping into intermediaries like Jesse's organization to get that into localities. And then another thing we talked about is the issue of shrinking civic spaces, and that being a huge issue in transparency and having that information open and out for the public. We mentioned that there are 3 actors that we need to mobilize to make sure the success of getting aid out there, but also making sure the aid is used the way that it should be, and that these 3 actors, we need to be working from the bottom up. So these 3 are the international actors like IFC and the World Bank Group, but then also the local governments and the local people. So instead of starting from the top bottom, we need to go from the bottom up. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have one more rapporteur, yeah?
Yeah, hi. My name is Nahida and I work with Christian Aid. So what we have discussed, it's like, we thought like it's the lack of accountability and the transparency from the IFIs. For example, we talked about the recent Resilience and Sustainable Trust of IMF, where they didn't inform or include the civil societies and the communities to discuss about the loan that they have, implemented. And as a consequence, these loans comes with conditionalities and so many strings attached with it. So as a consequence, the government implemented the, subsidy reform on electricity. Yeah. And then it, generates protest across the country because it's a life and death situation for the people. So we have been discussed, like, the IFIs should be accountable and be more transparent about this loan program or the grant, whatever they're giving to the countries. And on the other hand, our governments are also responsible because they are, signed the Human Rights Declaration. So it's their responsibility to do harm to the countries. So yeah, that was the discussion. And also we try to link it a bit with geopolitics, like how these geopolitics are affecting the climate finance. And it's not helping countries to, implement the NDCs that they have committed. So yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Did we cover all the groups, Celine? Is there one more?
Do you guys have any?
Okay.
We had a micro group over here. Stephanie Siegel, I'm with CGD and E3G both. But we were just talking based on Corinne's comment about the potential to connect NDCs to other mechanisms that already exist. And we were thinking, there's a capacity development program that exists with the IMF already on public financial management. And there's not the need to kind of create something from scratch, but to actually leverage things like annual surveillance and the capacity development program that already exists. And the thing that's missing is just the connective tissue between the NDC or a country platform and these annual engagements that are already ongoing. So I think, it was a great comment that you made because it just, identified where there, I think, is a lot of potential and something that's quite actionable in the near term.
Very good. So do we have our online speakers still? The system has crashed. Oh my God. So, all right. Well, let us do some conclusions here, and then hopefully we get our incredible colleagues from the field back on. But I think there's clearly these were very rich micro discussions. So, keen to tap more into that. Just a word of sort of what we're doing, and I think it builds off sort of using existing platforms. Of course, the MDBs and how we engage in many ways have a lot of this built in, but we need to obviously work more on the kinds of partnerships that are required to deliver well, whether it's on stakeholder engagement, whether it's on prior consultations, on prior actions or policy reforms. I think your point on subsidy reform or fiscal reforms and the prior consultation government needs to do to ensure those are sustainable. I mean, this is a massive issue. I mean, it led to, it wasn't on climate specifically, but the fiscal bill in Kenya, spurred the Gen Z riots. And that was actually explained to the population of why these fiscal reforms were regressive through TikTok and music festivals, right? And so young people are picking up, and there's a lot that can be done, and there's an incredible community of practitioners. I think the key thing about using existing frameworks is that they're important, but having principles and policies about engagement are not sufficient. And I think this is what this work is showing, is that you need to leverage an ecosystems out there. I mean, it was just at the Open Government Partnership, and this is a challenge is because there's an incredible ecosystem of actors that do this. Unfortunately, most of their work was not funded through mechanisms like the World Bank. It was funded through ODA. So these ecosystems were operating in parallel, but they were providing the enabling environment for whether it was the fund or the World Bank or domestic resources to have this element. So the key thing we want to emphasize here is the importance of the demand-side infrastructure. At the World Bank, we have a renewal of our civic and citizen engagement framework, so that's underway. Many of you in civil society have been engaged on that. We have the establishment of CIVIC, the Civil Society and Social Innovation Alliance, which is the successor to the GPSA, which is broadening well beyond just social accountability, but looking at these platform-based approaches and how we leverage in the right kinds of partnerships and the right kind of capital to ensure that these kinds of co-investments are happening alongside. And not just from the accountability and transparency side, but also in the delivery side. And the first platform on global health with the Global Financing Facility has been launched, and that will become operational. And we're obviously seeing a lot of crisis also in the health space, as in many others, where these civil society and social sector-led dimensions are very important to delivery. So let me turn to our two panelists here, and hopefully we get back our colleagues. So Anne and Jesse, I mean, you've both raised very important issues. I think you've shared a lot of richness in there, but maybe just help us stitch together the conversation. So from hearing about the hyper-local and the highly technical nature, I think that's the important element we're hearing from our panelists here. What we're talking about is very concrete. It's very technical. It takes policies and legislation and builds an architecture around what civic participation means to influence outcomes and to ensure accountability. And then this finance piece has come up a lot too, and the small amount of resources that can make a very significant difference. And I think we have great insights from across the audience here too. So just take a couple minutes each to sort of close up the conversation. So we'll start with you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated hearing the readouts from the group. And I think something I'd like to underscore is this notion that intermediaries can get money to local actors faster and in more effective ways. I think we need to keep repeating that because there is this trend of shift the power or thinking localization means cutting out any kind of intermediary. And I recognize as an international nonprofit, it may seem self-serving for me to say this, but I do think that trying to find all these groups on your own, especially if you're the World Bank, is going to be unbelievably difficult. And then that links to the second point of, fund what is already working. That doesn't mean don't do anything new, but there's so much good out there that in this time of limited resources, I think that is really critical. And the one point that I want to make that we haven't talked about here is I really think civic architecture has to now include threat reduction. This is something that, we used to look at kind of separate from the work of civil society, thinking that the enabling environment was how we could protect civil society. And, I remember back in the day supporting journalists and trying to help them with media freedom, and then newsprint and ink was being taxed, and that was the way that journalists and media was being shut down. So we have to be cognizant of the number of threats and the adjacent threats because they're only increasing. And I think our discussion today is very hopeful, very ambitious. But if we don't look at the threats to civil society, and it's not just funding, there's real, not only online harm, but physical harm that comes to groups and individuals who are working on these issues. And then lastly, I think I want to thank the WRI and the bank for pulling this conversation together. The hopeful note I'd like to end on is I think we just need continuous learning, and that so much has been cut from budgets on monitoring and evaluation, conferences, information dissemination. So I just want to thank you for pulling this together.
Thank you.
And for your participation.
We're out of time, so what I'll just say is that folks can find out more about the work that's going on under the Green Accountability Platform at greenaccountabilitynow.org. There's a report that WRI is publishing in December looking at climate finance governance systems, examining accountability mechanisms towards multilateral, bilateral, and other forms of climate finance. And as Ali referenced at the outset, there will be a published final evaluation of this work that I think will contain a lot of really important learning that reflects on, how effective this capacity building was. We have really creative ways, I think, and important ways of understanding how civil society organizations assess their own capacity to do technical work, organizational leadership, partnership building. And so, like Anne says, building on what's working, let's try not to try to make a new splash. If there's something that we can build on, is really important. So there's just a few follow-ups there, and folks can reach out if they'd like more information. So thanks for the space and
So
moderation.
thank you to all our speakers and especially to the ones who joined online, and Emma and Maria, we lost them. And to all of you for participating, please also follow Civic, the Civil Society and Social Innovation Alliance, on LinkedIn or at civicglobal.org. We're hoping to build out additional platforms on Civic in the coming year, and so please engage with us, and thank you for joining our session.
Thank you.